Jesse.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Robust American Love. My name is Karen Karbiener, and I'm president of the Walt Whitman Initiative. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and our mission is to celebrate New York's great literary legacy. We're also an organizing center for cultural activism and poetry-related events, including the one that you're just about to enjoy tonight. Please follow us on Facebook and Instagram and tune into our YouTube channel, as you may be doing now, to explore more presentations in our Robust American Love speaker series. If you like what we're doing, there are many ways to support our programs and initiatives. Please visit our website to find out how, or write to Walt at waltwhitmaninitiative.org. That's right, Walt himself at waltwhitmaninitiative.org. So we decided to offer this speaker series, and note the word speaker, these are not lectures, to promote timely public-facing conversations on Whitman's life, work, and legacy, and also greater poetic issues, especially issues in New York City. You'll hear conversations by teachers, poets, graduate students, artists, printers, neighborhood activists, doctors, you name it. They're not designed to be academic talks, but they're free, open, informal discussions that we end by inviting your questions for Q&A with our speakers. So if you are watching this live on YouTube, guys, please make sure to post your questions in the chat section. We will try to get to them at the end of the program if we have some free time. I'm not sure whether we will. We have a very dynamic speaker today. But you can also go to our YouTube site to see our past events that are all up there ready for your perusal. And if you want to know what's coming up in the future, just check out our website, waltwhitmaninitiative.org. It is not up yet, but we do have another speaker coming this month. We're going to skip next week. That's going to be a week off for us, but we're coming back in force on December 17th, that Thursday at 6 p.m., when Dr. Akash Goel will be speaking on Whitman and healing. Dr. Akash Goel is an assistant professor of medicine in the Division of Gastroenterology and Hepatology at Weill Cornell Medical Center in New York City, where he practices general gastroenterology. You can see that I don't usually say that word, right? And internal medicine with a focus on nutrition and integrative health. Akash is also a very dynamic cultural activist. He is widely published and frequently in peer-reviewed journals and the press. I just have been rereading his most recent article in the Washington Post, which is just absolutely fabulous. You can find him also on CNN, in the New York Times, Time Magazine, the Financial Times, BBC, and so forth. Among Akash's many accomplishments are when he was working for the William J. Clinton Foundation, he led the launch of India's national second-line ARV drug program that currently provides life-saving medication to tens of thousands of individuals living with HIV and AIDS, and that is in India. So Akash, a really amazing guy. I'm very privileged to know, and I look forward to our conversation in 2 weeks on Whitman and healing, perhaps something we really all need to be talking about now at the end of 2020. Tonight, we have a very dear friend, an incredible talent, a poet, a critic, an all-around amazing person. Jerome Ellison Murphy is here to speak with us about Walt Whitman and the Black poetic experience, dynamic range in photography and artistic vision. The title itself, Jerome, is so awesome, like a mouthful of energy. I just love it. And just to kind of introduce you just a little bit before we get into this, you wrote a piece this year, actually in April, in the Yale Review. And I was struck by that because I think, isn't the Yale Review, I think it's the oldest literary journal in the country.
I think that's right.
And I do believe that it was born the same year Walt was born in 1819. So a little
Yeah.
coincidence, but an absolutely gorgeous piece by Jerome in the Yale Review in April 2020 called Conspicuous Erudition, the New Black Poetry. And in that piece, Jerome discusses how we might admire Whitman's range of vision while questioning its specifics. And tonight he's going to be talking about that. He's going to address this idea of bringing a greater dynamic range or wider understanding to the artist's vision, and how that can provide a fuller picture, and how we can also apply that to our own work. And he, as a poet, will be specifically talking about his own poetry. Jerome Ellison Murphy earned his MFA from the Creative Writing Program at NYU, where he currently serves as undergraduate programs manager. He also co-curates the Bespoke reading series at the Bureau of General Services Queer Division bookstore. Okay, I had to look that up, Jerome, and I am so glad that I did. The Bureau of General Services Queer Division. Can you put in a word about that organization?
Oh, it's a great independent bookstore. They've been around for, I want to say, about 10 years. And they originally started in a gallery on the Lower East Side. They shared space with an art gallery. They then moved to another art gallery and finally have now found a home at the LGBT Center on 13th Street on the second floor. It's owned by a couple, Greg and Donnie, I want to say, and I forget the last names. And yeah, please support them. They have hosted a dynamic range of literary events and offer a wide range of material. Almost all of it LGBT related. I think not quite all, but so much to be found there. It's, you know, one of the sort of hidden gems, independent bookstore gems of the city. So
I did not know about it. And of course, I looked it up before I spoke with you tonight. And they have a really interesting selection of books that you can buy online at the Bureau of General Services Queer Division bookstore. I think we'll have to put up the link for this underneath the listing for your own talk, Jerome, so people know how to find it. And are you guys actively curating? Are you actively curating a reading series for them even now during COVID?
yes, we have done. We've raised a good amount for various organizations during COVID. But I think we are on hiatus until sometime in the new year. Everyone is just, you know, backed up. There's the holidays. So, but yeah, look for us. You can just Google Bespoke Reading Series or at the Bureau's website. So.
Well, this is why we really appreciate you having you here tonight. I know that everyone is super busy for some reason. COVID, right, has like taken up space on everybody's calendar. So wonderful to see you, and also to just review again all of these amazing things that you do. You're very widely published, and I have a long list of publications here from the LA Review of Books, Publishers Weekly, the Brooklyn Rail, Lambda Literary Review, and it goes on. And I see also that you previously have served on the board of the Lambda Literary Foundation, which is the world's foremost nonprofit supporting LGBT literature. So you yourself have been doing quite a bit of activism in the LGBTQ plus community.
Yes, that's right.
So,
Thank you for mentioning that too.
absolutely. I guess
organization to support. So.
right, the Lambda Literary Foundation, and just going to the website, I know that they have all sorts of awards every year, right? Book prizes and so forth, and they do a tremendous amount of good inside of the community. So wonderful to hear that you are connected with them as well. So I'm wondering, you know, like, okay, we're learning about what you do before who you are, but maybe that's one and the same. Maybe you could just tell us a little bit about yourself. I know that you are, you know, you're not going to brag about anything that you do. So maybe that's my job. But I thought that I would just highlight your middle name, Ellison. And I read somewhere online that you were born in Italy. So maybe two little talking points that you might include in your intro.
Yeah, and I wish there were a really interesting story behind that middle name. It's actually my father's first name, um, which I actually, in a way, I think is relevant to tonight's talk as we get into the subject matter. But that's my father's first name. He is Ellison Jordan Murphy, and so I'm Jerome Ellison Murphy. It's not a nom de plume. There's much of that in the literary world. There's many adopted names, but that is just my name. And I was born in Italy because my parents were both in the U.S. Army. So I was born at Camp Darby, which I don't think that's even in operation now, but it's near Pisa. My parents were both in the U.S. Army. So I don't think we need to say the year.
No, that's okay. I totally get that. But very poetic beginnings, right? Like even just having the name Ellison right in there. And then, this Italian kind of start. And what brought you to poetry?
Oh, it's such a good question. Well, I think what brings most of us to it, which is hearing it often in nursery rhymes or books. I mean, if you were lucky enough to have a parent or someone in the vicinity, right, in your formative years, who could read to you and bring you into that world of Mother Goose. I mean, I think it starts as simply, as elementally as that, right? Or other things in that vein. For me, Alice in Wonderland was huge formative influence. A family friend read that to me at, probably an earlier age than most would get it. I mean, I think I might have been, I don't know, 6, something like that.
And actually, knowing something about your poetry, because you are, for me, such a great wordsmith. And the playfulness of Lewis Carroll kind of makes sense there, right? Like there's maybe a lingering influence of that wordplay going on in your own work.
That's insightful. Thank you for saying that. I think there's another element to that, which is, my mother is a Caribbean immigrant. My mother's from Jamaica, which, as we know, is a former British colony. Wasn't independent till the early 60s. So there was a lot of sort of British culture, infrastructure, values in the air, right? Absorbed. My mom got Wordsworth in Catholic school, and decades later could still recite it. And there are writers, so many writers who grappled with complex legacies like that. I mean, Derek Walcott is maybe sort of the easiest example that comes to mind. It's a very complex legacy. So, but to bring it back to, what you're the point you're raising, I think something like Lewis Carroll sort of had sort of unforeseen resonances for me. I think because of that British colonial thing that's sort of in the air. Especially for my mom's generation. So I think those works of British authors, resonated with me a lot.
Wow. So, I'm thinking about my students, and I know many of them are watching right now, and they're always curious, especially the ones that are interested in poetry. How does it happen? Like, how do you become a poet? And you are a full-fledged poet now. Like, you're broadly published, you're writing about poetry. Did you major in creative writing in college? Did you already know then, or was this something that
not at all? I was rebelliously, I don't often like to admit this, but I was rebelliously a studio art major in college.
Wow, I didn't know that. Do you still draw, Jerome? I don't know this.
Not too much. Ironically, I did a lot of black and white photography work as part of that major, a lot of art history. And I think that's why this idea of dynamic range interests me. It's a term I've sort of stolen from photography to use as a metaphor. We did darkroom when I was doing it. We weren't even doing digital photography then. But I should have been an English major. I'm someone who should have been an English major. I took a really intensive year-long English residence-based course my freshman year. You actually had to apply for it and live in this dorm. It was sort of this weird, intensive cult of study. You actually lived with other students in this program. I did that for a year. And then at the end of that year, I said, I don't want to do this because reading is my joy. It's my recreation. And this is making it not recreation. I don't think you should have to read Don Quixote in a week and then pick it apart. It wasn't meant to be experienced that way, right? So, I was always interested in art. I did a lot of art making growing up, various kinds. So I sort of rebelled and did that. If looking back on it, it's pretty funny. I mean, if I had a kid in college who did that, I might say, I can't support that. I'm not on board, but my parents, I think, were used to me sort of defying those sort of rules.
So interesting. And I know just from knowing you that you are also an excellent reader of poetry. That's why I'm excited about, your presentation that you're going to be giving. And we're going to be talking about, hopefully, the 3 poems that we have listed on the website. Like that spoken word part of the poetry, was that always something that came along with your love of the word, the spoken word also?
Absolutely. I think so. I think so. I mean, like many, people of many backgrounds could say this. I think, I grew up around a lot of Jamaican patois, which is such an interesting gumbo of influences, right? African influences, British, all kinds of things. My mom's side of the family was very ethnically mixed, so her great grandfather was from China. Her last name, my mother's last name is Kong, K-O-N-G. So there's just a lot of influences in the air in my extended family growing up. So yeah, I think that sort of sense of music, verbal music, came from Jamaican patois, which I spoke until I went to American schools.
Wow.
My mom talks about that. She talks about, she says, you spoke nothing but patois till I sent you to school, and then you lost it. And I don't really even remember that, much. So. But it's there, it's in your bones. It's in your bones and your blood. And I recently was in a similar discussion with this professor, Anthony Reed, who's an extremely intimidatingly erudite professor. He's at Vanderbilt, African-American professor, who talks about how we absorb even sort of Western constructs of music and sound really early, We sing to the kids, we sing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. And, he sort of breaks it down using music theory that I was not part of my knowledge base. But he says, even the structure of a song or a melody that simple is a Western construct compared to these other ones, right? So things are that formative and that early, and we sort of take them for granted,
I see how this material ties in with your article, which I really want to get to. But just before that, if you were going to bring people to your poetry, is there a poem or a collection that you are most proud of that would be a great introduction to your work?
It's a great question. I think the poems online, I think the poems that you can find at gemwords.com, that's Jem, truly outrageous for those of you 80s babies. It's an inside joke. Gemwords.com, I have some publications there. I do think the poem Code Red is a pretty good entry, only because it's very topical. It was written in the aftermath of Ferguson, and it was written out of just a real excess of feeling I had and didn't know what to do with in the aftermath of Ferguson. And I think that's a good sort of entry, I think it's just very shareable. I think that's good, and maybe more accessible in some ways than some of the more experimental things.
Okay, thank you so much for that. So, and I know we're going to cover other poems as we speak with you, so people will get a good taste of some of your various styles. Maybe now is a good time to see that presentation on dynamic range. I'm eager to see it too, to sort of like frame our discussion. So,
well, it's going to start with a couple short video clips. Let me share my screen.
Great.
You can see my cluttered desktop there.
That's okay. These are informal talks.
Yes, very informal. And we're going to start with just a selection here. This is Archibald MacLeish, who is commissioned to write a poem on the occasion of the Apollo 11 moon landing.
Presence among us, wanderer in our skies, dazzle of silver in our leaves and on our water silver. Oh, silver evasion in our farthest thought, the visiting moon, the glimpses of the moon, and we have touched you. waste of time. Before the first men tasted time, we thought of you. You were a wonder to us, unattainable, a longing past the reach of longing, a light beyond our light, our lives, perhaps a meaning to us.
Okay. And now I'd like to share this.
One such poem, at least an early poem of ours that went in that direction, concerning the fact that millions and millions of dollars are continually sent into outer space while we continue to face the same problems here on the ground. Poem said, a rat done bit my sister Nell with Whitey on the moon, and her face and arms began to swell, and Whitey's on the moon. I can't pay no doctor bills, but Whitey's on the moon. 10 years from now, I'll be paying still while Whitey's on the moon. You know, the man just upped my rent last night because Whitey's on the moon. No hot water, no toilets, and no lights, but Whitey's on the moon. I wonder why he's upping me, because Whitey's on the moon. I was already giving him $50 a week, and now Whitey's on the moon. Taxes taking my whole damn check. The junkies make me a nervous wreck. The price of food is going up. And as if all that crap wasn't enough, a rat done bit my sister Nell with Whitey on the moon. Her face and arms began to swell, and Whitey's on the moon. Was all that money I made last year for Whitey on the moon? How come I ain't got no money here? Whitey's on the moon. You know, I just about had my fill of Whitey on the moon. I think I'll send these doctor bills, air mail special, to Whitey on the moon.
Okay, so we have a comparison here, right? We have a split screen view of this monumental occasion in American life, which was presented as a sort of universal triumph, right? One small step for man, one large step for mankind. I'm mangling the line that was already mangled by the astronaut when he spoke it. I think we have a picture here that's presented and then sort of critiqued, right? And if we put them together, we get a fuller picture, right? And this is sort of what I mean when talking about dynamic range, right? And so I would like to briefly just show you guys this article. I recommend everyone read it, and I can drop the link in the chat. It's over at the Poetry Foundation, really good website. Austin Allen is a brilliant young critic. So he has an article here on the moon in poetry, sort of just tracing the lineage of the moon in poetry. He writes about Sylvia Plath, Emily Dickinson, Borges, and he goes on. But I sort of argue that Austin Allen brings a really interesting dynamic range, what I call dynamic range, to this picture, because he gives us the conditions under which Archibald MacLeish wrote about the moon, and then he brings in Gil Scott-Heron, which is who you just saw. He talks about the protests that happened around space exploration, especially by Black activists who said, well, this money could be better spent, right, in social justice cause. He quotes, here's a part I like, he quotes W.H. Auden, who says, this was a chance for Auden to mock conventional masculinity, but he didn't quite jettison cliché himself. In Moon Landing from 1969, he writes, it's natural the boys should whoop it up for so huge a phallic triumph, an adventure it would not have occurred to women to think worthwhile. And he goes on. So then Austin Allen is sort of saying, well, we actually know how women were written out of this narrative, right? Written out of this narrative of this scientific triumph. So Austin Allen is bringing a sort of dynamic range to this picture. And so what do I mean by that? We can talk about that a little bit. So this is a term I sort of lifted from photography, and it's not a perfect metaphor. I will just warn you of that now, but I do find it sort of a useful one in thinking, right? So I'm just going to read this little summary of the concept. A digital or film-based image can only record so much detail between the darkest shadows of a scene and the brightest highlights, and eventually will render tones at this end of the scale as an effective black or white simply because there's not enough detail available. Each medium has its own dynamic range, and often the goal is to extend the range of tones in between the maximum and minimum values to create a more full feeling image, similar to the gradient that runs from pure black to pure white. And so they give an example of this. The gradient on the left, you would say, is a gradient of greater dynamic range because it travels more and shows more black and white. And then on the right, it's subtle, but you see a gradient that travels from black to sort of lighter gray. So it's a lesser dynamic range in that gradient. Right. So lifting this metaphorically, I say that we can say a critical eye with dynamic range has a lens trained in a variety of subjectivities, whether of race, class, gender, or genre. And I think that last one is really interesting, and we can get into that. But, you know, sort of cross-genre training, right, as a reader, I think is really interesting. You know, for example, it's interesting to know that Toni Morrison, at the time of her passing, had a Stephen King book on her nightstand, right? that's dynamic range, right? It shows Toni Morrison's dynamic range, of which there are numerous examples. And, you know, it would be interesting for a critic writing about Morrison to know that, right? Especially if that critic has read Stephen King. So things you might not immediately think of as having any sort of relation to each other can be brought together with an eye trained in dynamic range. So continuing this metaphor, we can say a well-trained critical lens will photograph a scene to render it in a way that is fuller, perhaps closer to reality, right? More close to what the human eye can capture, right? What's actually objective. Such a lens might look at Whitman and see omissions in this ostensibly objective, all-encompassing picture being presented to the reader as radically egalitarian, objective, or inclusive. Now, I do want to acknowledge right here that Whitman was radically egalitarian and radically inclusive for what he was doing. So that's why in the essay that you referenced, Karen, I say we can admire Whitman's reach while questioning his grasp, because we do need to acknowledge that Whitman was doing something radically egalitarian at the time. Mm-hmm. I'm quoting from the brilliant scholar, an absolute authority on Whitman, Ed Folsom. He says, in these leaves, Whitman wrote, everything is literally photographed. Nothing is poeticized, no divergence, not a step, not an inch, nothing for beauty's sake, no euphemism, no rhyme. Now, there's much to take issue with, when we apply that to Whitman's work, because we know like almost none of that is true. What interests me here in particular is the sense of photography, which Whitman was very interested in. He was probably the most photographed author of the century. He was just very interested in the idea that he could maybe do in words what this new rising art of photography was doing for reality, to paint a more, a rougher, realer picture, right? Give us something that's not sort of, what's the word? Less aesthetic, right, than a painting, let's say, something more objective. And of course, now we say photographs can lie, right? Photographs can lie in so many ways. Okay, so I have a selection from the essay here, sort of applying some dynamic range to Whitman's picture. How different might the national psyche appear if Whitman's vision of the learned astronomer, great poem, could have encompassed individuals like Benjamin Banneker, a 19th century free Black astronomer and land surveyor who published a successful series of almanacs, a very interesting figure who was in correspondence with Thomas Jefferson, for example, who sort of was forced to grudgingly acknowledge Banneker's abilities. Had it done so, the astronomer's charts and diagrams might have represented more than merely a repression of sensual experience, as Whitman presents it, perhaps even a vital form of liberation. And then we get into the figure of the Negro in Leaves of Grass, wordless recipient of sympathetic abolitionist gestures, picturesque giant with polished black limbs and a gaze of calm command over horses, can pose no such complicating question. Today, however, an awareness of Black intellectual accomplishment casts some doubt upon this text's loudly proclaimed all-inclusiveness. Ideals are one thing, their fulfillment another. We can admire Whitman's reach while questioning his grasp. So then there follows a passage where I go into some of the Black inventors whose inventions or patents were contemporaneous with Leaves of Grass, just sort of giving a fuller picture. I think the important point here is the American literary imagination, like its political one, has struggled mightily then and since to conceive of the Negro as a cognitive, not merely bodily reality. So then I quote, we move forward a century, and I quote the Black poet James A. Emanuel, sort of a lesser known Black poet, actually, very interesting writer. He has a poem called The Negro, possibly with Whitman in mind. Or he may be thinking of Langston Hughes, right? The Negro speaks of rivers, right? I mean, he's probably thinking of a lot here. He says of the Negro, never saw him, never can, hypothetical, haunting man. Eyes a saucer, yes sir, bosser. Dice a clicking, razor flicking. Thenness froze him in a dance. Unness never had a chance. So I'm interpreting this here in my way. Other people might feel differently. I say, Emanuel's formulation posits thenness as a condition of imposed caricature, denying the individual his individuality or unness. So we're talking about generalizing forms of perception. I mean, interestingly, I have in front of me this book called The Black Book by Toni Morrison, put together when Toni Morrison was actually still an editor in the 70s. It's just a compendium of rich Black history, very associatively compiled. I mean, there are bills of sale for slaves, there are patents, there are songs reproduced. You know, you can open up this at random, page 74. They failed to ask my name and called me Negro. That's a quotation from the poet Henry Dumas, who Morrison was actually instrumental in bringing back to light. And right below that, there's a reproduction of the title page of a pamphlet from 1901 called Is the Negro a Beast? Proving that the Negro is human from biblical, scientific, and historical standpoints by someone named William G. Shell. So, you know, a poem like this that we're looking at by James Emanuel just has a lot going on behind it, right? Critiquing, you know, a phrase like the Negro. So I quote from a poet, Danica Kelly. She has a poem catalog. And in this stanza, she says, you grow large, you are large. You are a 19th century poem. All of America is inside you, a catalog of lives and land and burrowing things. So she's describing a particular subjectivity there. In this poem, she's sort of addressing the self and talking about the sort of mercurial nature of the self, the multiplicity, that, you know, the sort of multitude containing self, right? First described by Whitman. And so, I mean, it's interesting to consider how radical Whitman's claims were for a white audience in his time to say that I'm one with all these things, high and low in society. I mean, and how much more radical that would seem to people being denied their full humanity, right? So I think that's one reason that Black poetic lineage is sort of inextricable from Whitman, and there's so many Black poets invoking Whitman, including Langston Hughes, including Yusef Kumunyaka, including so many. So they're very engaged with Whitman, and I think that's one of the reasons. The sense of capaciousness of the self, sort of radical freedom.
I want to stop you here. I'm enjoying the role of your discussion, Jerome, because this is, I mean, the article that you're reading from, Conspicuous Erudition, the New Black Poetry. I mean, within the title, you can see that Jerome is, it's an incredibly erudite piece. He's cruising through all of these wonderfully curated poems to provide us with sort of like a big picture. And I'm really grateful for the internal reading, especially of the connection of Whitman and the New Black Poetry, because when I read the title, I had no idea that Whitman would be included. But you're making a really good point that has puzzled a lot of readers. Like, why do Black poets gravitate to Whitman? Like starting with Langston Hughes or even earlier, right? I think Harriet Tubman was a fan of Whitman's as well. And Whitman weirdly doesn't often address Black people in his poetry. You know, like I think you quote the one moment that a lot of readers notice, you know, when he's admiring the driver of the wagon.
Right, we have that. Yeah.
But famously, if you read Whitman's Civil War poetry, Black people are weirdly missing, right, from the discussion.
Civil War. Right.
So, and there's this phenomenon of Black voices answering to Whitman. So I'm really intrigued with your reading of why this is happening. And here you go. Okay, I guess here you have the passage actually.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting looking at it, there's a lot to take away here, right? Because, I mean, you could look at this passage and say it's objectifying. You could look at this passage and say it's radically egalitarian in its vision. It's radically inclusive for the time. You could look at this and say it's homoerotic, right? You know, it sort of recalls the invisible hand of the richly dressed woman at her window looking at the bathers, right? You know,
and there is a theory, by the way, that one of Whitman's lovers during maybe the 1840s when he was in New Orleans, or maybe even in New York, that he had a Black lover, and that kind of emerges subtly in pieces like this, the love of the Black body.
So there's a robust American love happening here.
Literally, yes, and also in I Sing the Body Electric, right? You've got these amazing descriptions of the body at auction.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, you could say that this is loving. I mean, you know, so what's, you know, I always think of this that Shakespeare quote where he says, "There's nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so." Now, I'm not sure that applies, you know, universally, but it comes to mind a lot when you're looking at things of sort of socio-political complexity like this. So, I mean, it's interesting. It's a very interesting moment.
And especially with Whitman, you know, earlier in Robust American Love, the speaker series, we had Lavelle Porter on with Matt Miller talking about Whitman's problematic relationship with race, right? Because even though he writes these, as you have up here, Song of Myself, I think of I Sing the Body Electric, I think The Sleepers too, all of these earlier poems written in the mid 1850s originally, they have an openness that later seems to close, right? And Whitman does have, and later said some, you know, very distasteful things about race and about black people. So I'm interested in particular in how you say a Black poet must confront this, right? There's a, you know, he's at one point, he's at one time an unavoidable figure, but he's also a real problem, right? I mean, how do you, let's just bring it to your own work, because I mean, would you say that, I guess you would say this because you're saying that all Black poets have to wrestle with this undeniable Whitmanic heritage. Is that right?
Well, I don't know if they have to. I think they are. I think many Black poets are drawn to it, though. I think, you know, for the reasons we previously mentioned. But I mean, I would quote Jericho Brown here, who won the Pulitzer Prize recently. You know, he says Whitman's poems are better than Whitman. And he says, you know, when he's teaching, you know, what we might call now problematic authors, he says he just sort of frames it historically for his students and says, you know, this is something not to do now, right? This is sort of, we know better, we do better. This actually came up in the context of discussion on Sylvia Plath. Right now I'm writing a piece, my next piece for the Yale Review is about sort of the problem of Sylvia Plath in a more woke moment. And so I've been asking a lot of writers to, you know, how they teach her, because she's got the N-word in her title poem, right, of her collection Ariel. You know, I think she's a great poet, but one of the cases I sort of make for Plath's enduring value is that she is a writer of dynamic range compared to, say, Sexton, meaning in this case that she is widely trained in literary tradition.
Right.
And that's reflected in her work, importantly. But she's got blind spots. She's got blind spots, right? I mean, just like Auden, you know, is in that moon landing poem is critiquing, you know, patriarchy, and he's also dissing women, saying, oh, well, this would have occurred to women to do, you know. He's writing out the actual women who were involved in this endeavor. So, you know, dynamic range is a lessening of our own individual blind spots, in my mind. It means we've read widely. I mean, I have Claudia Rankin's latest book here. It's called Just Us. It's a follow-up to Citizen, which, you know, for people who don't know, Citizen was a sort of mixed multimedia poetry project written mostly in second person. So everything's you do this, you do that, you get on the train, you do that. Written from a second person that places readers in the position of Black people facing microaggressions as they go about their daily lives. And Citizen did a lot for a lot of readers who did not have that dynamic range before, right? Did not have that perspective before. So it's a sort of plea for an increased dynamic range and looking at a picture. And now people who have read that book will maybe take different mental snapshots of given situations. You know, there's a moment in this book, which actually, for me, was a better read than Citizen, actually. In this book, she's having conversations with people directly about their own privilege. Anyway, there's a good little moment where she is at the airport and watching a group of white, presumably straight, businessmen cutting in line, just cutting in front of everybody. And she's standing next to a white man, and she turns to him and says, "Now that is white male privilege." And then they both laugh. She and the white man laugh. And it's an interesting example of, you know, them sharing this moment and the white man beside her being sort of taken out of his own whiteness and maleness to see, you know, see this from another perspective, right? So you think that maybe going forward, that man might view that scene in a different way than he would have before that moment. So that's what I'm talking about when I say, you know, dynamic range.
I'm getting a very good sense of it from all of these examples. Thank you so much. Your range is also dynamic because you're covering so much ground here. And I wondered if you could also talk about Yusef Komunyakaa, who I know you know quite well,
Yeah.
and he features very prominently in your piece. You know, I think you're attending a Have Khanum celebration of Komunyakaa at the very beginning of the poem. And of course, Komunyakaa is a big Whitman celebrator.
Yes.
Right? Has written about Whitman and defended Whitman. Any words about Komunyakaa's dynamic range and his relationship with Whitman?
Well, I think that's a great example of dynamic range, because it's funny you ask about Komunyakaa, because I just had to write a review of his most recent selected poems. There were 20 years worth. And I was just marveling at the sort of range in these poems, which sweep over natural history. I mean, we get insect life, and sweep over sort of canonical Western history, but also bring in things from jazz and blues, very informed by jazz and deep knowledge of jazz, blues, soul music. So I would say Komunyakaa is a good example of a poet with dynamic range, meaning that he is just trained across a variety of bases of experience and knowledge. I would imagine that for a creative artist of his sort of wide-ranging curiosity, a figure like Whitman really appeals to him. You know, Whitman who sort of catalogs, ostensibly catalogs every social strata, right? And then the natural world as well, right? He's a poet of the city, and I am one of the I'm part of the pulse and flow of pedestrian life in the city, but also I need to get away from this astronomer and walk out alone under the stars, So there's just sort of a capaciousness there, I contain multitudes, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so I think that can appeal to poets. I want to make one quick point here, Karen, too. And I keep bringing up Toni Morrison because she's such an important figure for me in terms of dynamic range. She has an essay, and I forget which one it is now, but it's collected in What Moves at the Margin, a great essay collection, where she talks about one of the sort of characteristics of sort of Black art is a sense of the tribe or the sort of collective, right? And I think Whitman is an interesting figure for many Black artists because he sort of claims a radical individuality, right? Mm-hmm. That I think is very intriguing to Black artists who always are sort of grappling with a sense of the collective in a way. You do see poets of radical individuality in the Black tradition, but I think often what you see is a sort of grappling with that sense of, how individual can I be when there is a sort of project of collective liberation underway. There's a sort of social conscience there, which I think is very characteristic of a lot of Black literature. So, Anyway.
Well, yeah, speaking of which, I don't want to let the hour slip by without getting to your poetry as well. And thinking about how this proposed wider understanding affects your own literary aspirations. And I know on the website, we have posted just for the listeners who are listening live, or I guess later as well. And I'm going to share my screen now. Let me make sure that I have everything set up here. For looking at 3 of Jerome's poems. And here is our listing. And right here are the readings. So do you want to introduce these at all, Jerome? Or shall we just, you know what, I would love if you would read them, because you are, as I've been bragging about, such an amazing reader. And I'm sure you don't even have to, do you have all of your poems memorized, or?
Some of them. I'm a little rusty at the moment, but some of them I do. This one I probably do. But this is, the context for this poem is that it was written in answer to a call for poetry about periodic table of elements. You know, there was a call for poems about various elements. And so Mercury had always just sort of fascinated me as a sort of hard to pin down thing, right? Literally and figuratively. So, okay, I'll read it. Periodic Prayer 1, Mercury. Mockery, mirroring arc and descent, funhouse of one, you escape, one drop of outer space, possibilities Narcissus. Birthed again with a slip through these fingertips, forceps, flee into a dive and ricochet to reoccur, a more tremulous maybe. Undersea, shirk identity, its tentacle clutch, let intent, dark as dye, furl away.
Absolutely gorgeous. I mean, it's gorgeous on the page, but I feel like I like it even better when you read it. You know, just the playfulness and the pleasing sounds of it. But going back to your dynamic range idea, can you speak to how that, you know, that works way into your own art?
Absolutely. I do think there are a couple interesting moments here that maybe speak to the you know, the conversation we're having. I think one is in the second stanza there, where it says, you escape one drop of outer space. You know, and I think that one drop is a moment for me of, you know, there's a resonance there, there's a sort of auditory connotation there of the one drop rule, right? Which is, you know, the idea that one drop of Black blood up through Jim Crow, let's say, would classify someone as Black or as Negro, right? And this, I mean, this is in popular culture in so many ways. I mean, there's Hollywood movies about people who realize that somebody is actually Negro, right? And it's a scandal, right? There's a movie called, it's from the 50s, there's a movie called Kings Go Forth. It's got Frank Sinatra and Tony Curtis in it. And the plot is that these two men are rivals for the affections of this woman who, it's revealed, has Negro blood, and she's sort of passing as white, right? So anyway, there's this idea that throughout American history that one drop of blood makes you Black, right? So anyway, I think that it sort of inflects this poem because there's sort of an irony here that the Mercury is sort of identityless, right? It can take on various shapes. I mean, that's sort of the idea of the poem anyway. It's the Mercury cannot be pinned down that way. There's a sort of freedom and, you know, well, you know, I'm trying not to say mercurial.
It's actually such a treat to hear a poet talk about his work. So I'm just enjoying every minute of this. So by all means, carry on.
I mean, so I think, yeah, I think the other moment is right below that too, where possibilities Narcissus is a phrase, you know, to describe this sort of rolling ball of Mercury, right? The idea that this element, this little drop of this element can sort of endlessly reflect and endlessly reshape itself, and sort of, it's not, again, not pinned down to identity. And, you know, I mean, Narcissus is a pretty familiar reference. But not everyone might know it, and it's Greek mythology, right? Narcissus falls in love with his reflection and drowns. So, possibilities Narcissus is sort of saying, this element is in love with its own sort of endless possibility for identity. So I think, I think I probably wouldn't overinterpret it much more than that, but there's a lot here. I mean, okay, toward the end of the poem, we have I dive into the sea, and we're describing sort of a sea, underwater scene. So that to me, as the writer, alludes to the idea of mercury in the oceans, right? Mercury in the water. So, and maybe you could argue that, to know something about that would increase one's dynamic range in terms of understanding the poem, right, more fully. So it's definitely part of what I bring to writing a poem like this. So.
I love the explanation, and you're bringing things that I did not see in it. I guess when I read your work, and this poem is a great example of that, I just find myself washed over by the sensual pleasure of the way that it sounds. And even if I don't understand fully what you're trying to represent, like those last two lines blew me away. Undersea, shirk identity, its tentacle clutch, let intent dark as dye furl away. I mean, I'm right there in the Museum of Natural History with that squid right there, and the squid ink and the sort of the sensual pleasure of the ocean. You're making me think a little bit of Whitman's poem, The World Beneath the Brine, because he loves to bring people down there as well and have this deep love of the sea. But honestly, I don't see a whole lot I would say would be Whitmanic when I read this poem. Like you're much more finessed sense of wordplay. I mean, Walt just never did this, right? He was pretty dead on, like Ed's quotation that you had before, it's like photographs out there. So should we be feeling the Whitmanic influence like behind this? Is there such a thing? Is there something like that going on?
I think that's such a great question. I mean, I would say that for me there is, because the poem at one level is sort of grappling with this idea of a limitation of identity versus an endless sort of freedom of identity, right? And then sort of unrestricted or unbound sense of possibility, right? So I think for me, which is a Whitmanic concept, and so I think for me that grappling is there sort of subtly. I think it does sort of engage with that idea we were talking about earlier. That often I think that is something that Black poets are drawn to in Whitman because they want to grapple with that idea.
So I'm going to move to the next poem because I definitely want to show off all three of these. And this is another one that, I mean, just hit me so hard, but I would love it, Jerome, if you would read this out loud. That would be great.
Okay, the poem is called Own. Sure, I'll be that. Be the cast shadow of all you've imagined. I do to that tune. Do backwards and stilettoed limbs tied. Yes, I'd be pet. Be so starvably ravenous. Babysit, dessert for the sated, no appetite, I takes it. Saintly, so lash I to stakes of your choice. Eyes decapitatable twice. Crackle dry, arson away. Dismember every limb of such arachnidity. Only heed intoxication's own condition, dilution. Like oxygen, a toxin alone. Though you need, don't inhale unadulterated that. Lung that and leave I alone.
Wow. So I think to me, this is a poem about the Black experience, right? That's something that emerges right away, that this is a Black poet's poem.
Right.
I'm not exactly sure why I feel that. I guess like your play with, especially with the slang here takes me there, and that sense of objectification, I guess, that I get in the poem.
Yeah, I think that's right, and there's this idea, the French poet Rimbaud, his famous concept is I is an other, I think this is sort of engaging with that idea of the self being othered by the racial imagination, right? So, we were talking earlier about this figure of the Negro, right, that some Black poets are speaking back to. And I think this poem is sort of engaging in that way from the first line. saying, you know, sure, I'll be that. I'll be the cast shadow of all you imagine, right? Sort of saying, I'll be this sort of shadow figure. You know, I guess this poem came out of, again, I think it was written right around that same time as that other poem I mentioned. I think it came out of a sort of frustration with the limited racial imagination, right? This sort of stereotyping imagination. And this poem's a few years old now, and it's funny, I'm not sure I could write it today. I think the landscape has changed enough in a few short years. I'm not sure this poem would have arisen for me in the same way.
What year did you write this?
Oh God, I think this was 2015, maybe 2016.
Not that long ago, but you're talking about sort of the difference between Black Lives Matter and not, I guess.
Yeah, and also, you know, a difference in imagination, which we see reflected in popular culture, you know? I mean, there's been Black Panther, right? There's been Get Out. There's been, you know, Jordan Peele has done, you know, Netflix projects. There's an increasing range, right, of representation and of possibility, right, for Black representation in media. I mean, I've always argued with my friends and everything. I've always argued that that is really one of the important sort of fronts of battle for equality is actually the imaginary one. The racial imagination. I mean, the racial imagination informs implicit bias, right? It informs, you know, how a cop sees a young Black man, right? All those things are formed partially by popular culture, which can include music, which can include film, which can include all kinds of things. Can include magazine, photo shoots, all, you know, you name it. So I think the imagination is really important here. But I'm not sure that it's such a stark state of affairs as it seemed to me at the time.
That's so interesting to think about, especially from a poet, to think about an expiration date for a sort of a message, right? Or maybe a time capsule feeling to what's going on here.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, if I would make a case for this poem sort of lasting in any way, I think I would say it's sort of an exploration of extreme sort of vulnerability, almost like in an S&M kind of way, right? So I think I would, you know, hope and think the poem isn't limited to its particular moment in the American racial landscape, but, you know, it did sort of arise and, you know, out of that for me, I think.
I'm really intrigued by the title.
Oh, yeah.
You know, that for me ties in with your last line somehow. You know, there's own and alone.
Yeah.
But just, you know, really thoughtful work. And we have a few minutes, so I just want to get to the last one. Our Mother's Hands.
Yes, Our Mother's Hands. Balanced whole islands of British shillings, broke chicken necks, though yard chicks were nicknamed pets. Executors of all remedy against that dark alphabet, swarming irrepressible out of anthills behind the sink cracks. 62, independent, engaged, finger extended for the next decade's ring the colony comes into her overripe own. Over hills scarred as shoulder blades from which plumage once fanned, then to market, wearing out and in calloused roads, came one's trundling aches, professorial burrowed, phrenologists of fruit noggin, connoisseurs of sweet brews, sashayed to trace lines in Jamaica's own hand, returned home to knit tendons of memory with recipes, with reflex to massage the raw patty with spice, unspiral ripe peel in one kiss clean clockwine, work that texture like patois into oxtail stew. Craws full of starched English, forbid to leave their set tables, rechew, retrue, till enunciations cleaned to bleached bone. Off trellis, their Catholic school cursive sways on its root, my hair recalling childhood's signature cringe, its gel pat flat lines, this left margin part as if only reverent penmanship might earn the stray curlicues.
Wow, what a gorgeous last image you leave us with. And now that you've told us something about your life, of course, we are reading into this, like that you are in here, right?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
So I wondered about Our Mother's Hands, because it's plural mothers, right? Mothers, S apostrophe instead of apostrophe S.
Yes.
So can you speak to why it's collectively more than one mother?
Yeah, I did sort of see this as a collective vision. I mean, I thought of my cousins a lot writing this. My mom is from a very large family. She's one of 12 kids. So I have lots of aunts and uncles, tons of cousins. I have never bothered to actually count them, but there's many, many cousins. So, and everyone came to America for various reasons. Yeah, I think for me, this is sort of a complex exploration of this sort of severe form of motherhood, right? It's sort of an admiration and appreciation for what these mothers did and the ways in which they maintained society, right? But I think the poem is sort of hinting at there's a colonial element to it, right? And that colonial element shades into cultural assimilation, right, of immigrants. So, these mothers are sort of doing what they had to do, but there is a sort of severity to it, right, that affects the kids. So I was trying to kind of give an appreciative, loving, but complex picture. So.
And it absolutely is. It's gorgeous. It sounds gorgeous. It creates a world. I'm right there in Jamaica, kind of experiencing the scenes and the I guess a bit of you, right? Like things that are floating around in your head, that energy, that background, and that heritage it's just beautiful. Jerome, thank you so much for sharing these poems. I feel like we have not done them justice, but we are out of time, and that means I just have to invite you back.
Oh yeah.
So
great.
To continue the conversation. Is there something that you would like to add? Finally, maybe, I guess we went over where everyone can experience your poetry. Maybe you can give that website one more time.
Oh, yes. Maybe I can drop it in the chat, actually.
That would be excellent.
There we go. And I'm going to also drop the name of this brilliant young critic and poet, Austin Allen. You could just Google him, look him up. He's a brilliant critic of dynamic range, I would argue. Excellent example of a straight white male critic of dynamic range in writing about poetry and literature. So I'm a fan of Austin Allen's. I recommend everyone read him. Well, I just want to say this was so great, Karen, and
oh, well, for us, we have experienced your dynamic range. I mean, you just took over, Jerome, and I have learned so much. It is such a treat. And for anyone who has watched this and just basked in all of the many poems and the insights that Jerome had, please go and read his article in the Yale Review. It is outstanding. And it also has this dynamic range that we've seen in action here. So Jerome, you are the one that I want to thank. Thank you so much for taking the time to come and chat about Black poetry, about Whitman's relationship to it, and about your own work. And I'm hoping to see a lot more of you as soon as we get this silly vaccine off the ground.
I thank you for all your attention and insight and all your robust American love. So
sending it out there to everybody. Thank you so much, Jerome. And thank you everybody for tuning in. Again, no show next week, but 2 weeks from today, please tune in for Dr. Akash Goel. Good night, everybody. Thank you. Also, one more thing, I must say this, and I always forget. Jesse Morandi is pulling all of the strings to make this show happen. Jesse, you are amazing. You should be, we should have a memorial for you, but we don't believe in memorials anymore. But anyway, we owe Jesse a whole lot for just being here. So thank you so much, Jesse. Thank you again, Jerome.